I want to congratulate the honoree, Steve Scheller, and I will tell you that I also represented SEIU, and I actually ended up, because of my representation, in prison for my entire summer vacation in maximum security prison in Puerto Rico with my roommate, who was my client, who was the president of SEIU National. I have a very close friendship with him to this day. My family has a long relationship with Thurgood Marshall. Obviously, my uncle, President Kennedy, appointed him to the Court of Appeals. I grew up at Hickory Hill seeing him and seeing Justice White and the other justices of the Supreme Court regularly. I went to, my classmate in law school was his son, Goody Marshall, who became very close friends, who then went and worked for my Uncle Teddy, and then was chief of staff for Al Gore. And so I spent a lot of time with the family at that point. But I'm not going to talk so much about his biography. I'm going to just talk for a couple minutes and tell you a couple of stories about kind of the, how my life has revolved around Thurgood Marshall and his values and touched him in some ways that evoke his values. And I'll start by telling a recent story. Last week, I have a cousin who was on my mother's side, who was convicted of a murder that he didn't commit. And he spent 11 years in prison. And he was recently released on a habeas corpus petition for having at the Court of Appeals for ineffective counsel. He had a very bad lawyer. And the prosecutor from the state of Connecticut has appealed that. And last week, we were at a hearing in front of the Supreme Court of Connecticut. 6 justices sitting. And Michael now has a very good lawyer, one of the best criminal trial lawyers in Connecticut, called Hugh B. Santos. As most of you know, the threshold for an ineffective counsel victory is very, very high. You basically have to show that your client was indigent, the lawyer went to sleep, or was drunk during the entire proceeding. It's very, very high. It's very hard to get that. So Hugh B. Santos was arguing to the Supreme Court, and he told them a story about the first time he had argued an ineffective counsel petition 25 years before. And it was in the Court of Appeals in New York City for the Second Circuit, which covers Connecticut. And he was making, it was again a high threshold case. He was making an argument, and the other judges, there's 3 judges on the panel, and 2 of the judges said, this has to be a high threshold. And there was a 3rd judge sitting, and he said, you know what the only threshold should be? The only threshold should be, did he get a fair lick? That's it. And that judge was Thurgood Marshall. And this was after he retired from the Supreme Court. He sat as a retired justice on the Court of Appeals. And that was his attitude. And his attitude was not just look at what the law says. It's do what he said is, my attitude is, you do the right thing and then you let the law catch up with you. And when I was a little boy, I was born in the state of Virginia. When I was born in the state of Virginia, it was against the law for a black man to marry a white woman. It was, and vice versa. It was against the law. The law said that if you were a black person, you had to be identified by race on your birth certificate. You had to be raised in a segregated neighborhood. You had to attend segregated schools, lunch counters, public facilities, parks, transportation, prisons, mental hospitals. We're all segregated by law. That's what the law said. It wasn't right, but that's what the law said. When you died, you were buried in a segregated cemetery, and by law, you were identified by race on your death certificate. And this imposition of second-class citizenship on an entire race of American citizens was maintained and enforced through a system of official corruption and unofficial intimidation designed to keep black people from voting. So an entire race was excluded from our democracy. And Thurgood Marshall played the pivotal role in making this country a true constitutional democracy for the first time in its history. And in that sense, he's much a hero of the American experience and American democracy as any of the patriots who gave their lives, their property, or their blood in the American Revolution. And he suffered for what he did. He stood up to abuse his entire life. And he stood up. He always, even when he was going to get appointed to the Court of Appeals, he had to go fight with my father because they didn't want to do it at that time. They said, no blacks has ever been to the Court of Appeals. We'll put you in the district court. But don't call that, cause us trouble. We're trying to fight the Russians now. He said, I don't want to be on the district court. I want to be on the Court of Appeals. Oh, he had that part of him that was willing to stand up for what was right, and then the law catch up to him. When I was a little boy, I was fascinated with Africa. And my father showed me a picture about Africa when I was 6 years old. It was called Africa Speaks. It was a 16-millimeter film, and we saw it in our basement. From then on, I couldn't think of anything but Africa. And then in 1960, this group of Africans came to our country in the Cape, and I'd never seen an African before. And I was so excited about it. And they were going to see my uncle, President Kennedy, at the beginning of the summer, who was then running for president. And I went over and saw these men in their dashikis and their African costumes. And I couldn't believe I was looking at real Africans. The man who came to see him was a man named Tom Mboya, who was a labor leader from Kenya. And Tom Mboya was from the smallest tribe in Kenya, which was called the Luau tribe. It was a fish-eating tribe from up in Lake Victoria. And he had realized, and they're regarded as peacemakers and very, very smart people. He had realized the British, they had the Mau Mau in the 50s, and the British had said, we're beaten, we're getting out, we're going to give you 4 years to figure out how to rule yourselves, then we're leaving. Between 1959 and 1964, they had to figure out how to govern that country. And Tom Mboya realized there's not a single black person in our country who has a graduate degree. And he said, we have to train the people who are going to run this country. So he wrote to every college in the United States and said, will you give one scholarship to one Kenyan kid, and I will choose the best kids in our country, the smartest. 200 colleges said yes, including Harvard. But he couldn't get the money to bring them over. So he went to the State Department and President and Vice President Nixon, and they wouldn't help him. He needed $200,000. And my uncle, Jack Kennedy, was the head of the subcommittee on Africa in the United States Senate, the Committee on Foreign Affairs. He had an intense interest in Africa. He made a famous speech about Africa in 1956 where he said Africans should rule Africa. Tom Mboya thought, you know, I'm going to go make him put his money where his mouth is. So he came to Hyannisport, and he met with my uncle. And Mboya was a labor leader, but he was uneducated, self-educated. And his heroes were Mahatma Gandhi and Thomas Jefferson and Henry David Thoreau. And my uncle was so impressed with him. The Kennedy Memorial only gives to cause of intellectual disability, so they couldn't give money to him. So my uncle, President Kennedy, wrote a personal check for $200,000, and he said, the condition I'm giving you this check is that you don't tell anybody, because Jack was very frightened. His advisors didn't want him to give it to Mboya because he thought if the Southerners found out that he had given it to Mboya, that he would lose all the white vote in the South. So, but Nixon found out about it and released the information, and it became known as the Kennedy Airlift. So, and at that point, it was a scary thing for people in the United States. We were bringing all these, black people over from Africa. So, when my father was killed in 1968, I have 11 brothers and sisters. And the 4 oldest ones were all sent to get us out of the house. My other David was sent to work for Cesar Chavez. My sister Kathleen was sent to work for the Inuit Indians up in Alaska. My brother Joe was sent out to Mount Rainier to be a guide for Jim Whitaker. And I was sent to Africa for the summer. And I spent the summer with Tom Mboya. And I left in August, and he was assassinated. He was the heir apparent to Jomo Kenyatta, who was the liberator of, the George Washington. Kenyatta was part of the Kikuyu tribe and wanted it to go to his deputy, Daniel Arap Moi, and they killed Tom Mboya right after I left. So in 2004, I was living on Martha's Vineyard with Larry David, who would subsequently introduce me to my wife, Cheryl Hines. We lived together for 2 summers on the vineyard, and I was supposed to speak at the convention, which was in Boston. I flew up to the convention, and Larry flew me up, and I went and gave my speech on the environment. But right after I spoke, this young African-American senator, first-term senator, who nobody had heard of, from Illinois, spoke right after me, Barack Obama. And we were backstage with him, and he said, I'm going to Martha's Vineyard after the speech to do some fundraising in Oak Bluff. And Larry said, we'll give you a ride down in the plane. So Barack Obama came down with us, and we ate dinner with him that night. And while we were eating dinner, I said to him, where are you from, et cetera? And he said that his father was Kenyan. And I said, what tribe was he from? And he said he was from the Luau tribe. And I said, really? Have you ever heard of Tom Mboya? And he said, Tom Mboya is the reason I'm in this country. My father was the first child brought over on the Kennedy airlift. The day before Tom Mboya came to my house at the Cape, he'd gone to Washington, D.C., and met with Thurgood Marshall. And he said to him, we're about to get liberation, and we need a constitution, and we don't want a white man to write it. We want a black man to write it. And he flew back with Thurgood Marshall, who had just left the NAACP, and Thurgood Marshall wrote the Constitution for Kenya. So not only is Thurgood Marshall one of the fathers of American democracy, but he's also the father of Kenyan democracy. And that's something that most people don't know.